So we've recently gotten a handful of interviews with some of the developers of Diablo 4, and not only did we get some new information on Season 11, but also some learnings from the Season 11 PTR, and even information on the future of Diablo 4 as a whole. And some of this information is actually quite impactful for the future of the game, but one of the things I really wanted to go over are the changes and updates for Sanctification we're getting with Season 11, because not only have we gotten information on some of the big changes that they've made to this new crafting system, but we also got a decent bit of information on how they're developing this system and what their original thoughts about this system was. More specifically, that this system was actually being developed as a permanent part of the game and less like a new season feature. Now, if you haven't heard of this feature, this is a Season 11 specific feature, or as we know it right now, it's a Season 11 specific feature, and this is a new crafting system with Season 11, where essentially you get a new currency from doing the new Season 11 stuff that you can then take to this Heavenly Forge, and you can sanctify an item which locks that item, so after that you can do nothing to that item anymore except add or remove sockets or runes from it, and it can have one of a handful of extremely strong effects. So essentially how you'd want to be using this system is you would get your item, you would do all of the other crafting elements, you would temper it, you would masterwork it, you would enchant it, you would add the legendary aspect on it you want, or if it's a unique or mythic, you would just skip most of those steps. And then for a final part, you would sanctify it, which would be able to apply one of these effects. So you'd be able to add a bonus legendary power, so a legendary aspect that's incredibly strong, and you would not only be able to have, say, 2 legendary aspects on a legendary, but you could get a legendary aspect on a unique or a mythic, improve an affix into a greater affix, add a bonus affix from a pool of special sanctification affixes, and these sanctification affixes are a bunch of existing affixes just as higher rolls, and some new ones like multiplicative damage increases for certain elemental types that your class can use. So let's say I'm playing a druid, I could get a multiplicative poison damage increase or lightning damage increase. Then there is replace an existing affix with one of those sanctification affixes, so the buffed up affixes. This is the one place that you could brick items, or so people have been saying, but that was incredibly rare. I will have a video linked in the description that went over the odds of getting all of these different rolls and what would be the odds of getting a weaker item or bricking an item. And based upon the first iteration of the system, it was something like 2.5% to get a worse item than you originally had. So I do think a lot of the worries of the community of bricking items was majorly overstated, but then the final possible roll was make your item indestructible so it can't lose durability. Now, one of the first changes they talked about is they're just removing that possible roll, so you now can't get the roll of indestructible, which was kind of a boring roll. It didn't really do anything, but they're kind of removing that because this system is currently still Season 11 specific. So that's kind of a base overview of the system. It's essentially the last part you would do on an item, and since there is a very low chance of getting a bad outcome for an item, this is something you probably wouldn't want to do unless you have a replacement for that item slot. Now, we did get some updates and new information on the system. The first one I already went over. Indestructible is just removed from all of the outcomes. And what's also pretty interesting is one of the reasons this was even a role in the first place is because Sanctification was actually being tuned with Eternal in mind, meaning it was being tuned as a permanent addition to the game, even though they've been saying it's a Season 11 specific thing. Now, the reason behind this is if they're making a new system and it's going to be kept in the game as an Eternal system or a permanent system in the game, they can't make it absolutely crazy, because most of the new systems that get added with a season that are season specific have an expectation that they're going to be much stronger than Eternal things, and they can generally be much more crazy with the season specific things because they're gone at the end of the season. But if it's Eternal, they have to design it with that in mind, so it's not crazy overpowered because it'd be a permanent addition to the game. And if they just kept crazy strong things in the game like Chaos Armor from Season 10, that being added to the next season or to Eternal would just be ridiculous power scaling, and you would end up in a game that's just way too easy and nothing really matters because everything's just so strong. But even though they were developing this system with Eternal in mind, it seems like specifically for for Season 11, they are trying to make Sanctification much more flashy and just much more powerful in general. One of those things being the removal of being able to get indestructible as a role. Now, this doesn't mean that Sanctification is not going to be brought back as an eternal system. They're just trying to make the Season 11 version a much stronger, more flashy version of that system. And they were also designing this as the final step of upgrading your gear and a bit of a gambling step, because one of the things they talked about in multiple of these interviews is that to have something that's really interesting, you need a downside and an upside. You can't have something that's just all upsides. That makes it not really interesting. It doesn't give you that gambling feel, and it generally isn't super interesting, because that's one of the ways in which most ARPGs and RPGs actually add that dopamine and have really interesting systems. There usually has to be some sort of possible downside. Now, another pretty big change they talked about is having much less of a chance for higher rarity items. So I think more specifically mythics and potentially unique items as well shouldn't have the ability or have a much lower chance for their defining stats to be able to be removed. Because like I mentioned, the one area that you could kind of brick an item or make it much worse is replace an existing affix with a random Sanctification affix. And if that is applied to a mythic, you could potentially have a ridiculously strong stat being removed that could potentially make that mythic not even really usable or worthwhile for you to use anymore. So it seems like they're going on a case-by-case basis where if a mythic or a unique has some specific stat that's not like a more generic stat, that you won't be able to remove that and replace it with another affix. So that should alleviate a lot of the bigger bricking concerns, because high rarity items like uniques or mythic uniques are the much more rare items, and getting those could take a lot of time, especially mythics. So they don't really want you making those items weaker or bricking them, but they seem to be completely fine with something like a legendary item being able to have a downside for that system, which I also think is completely fine. Except necklaces, pretty much every other slot you'd have a legendary in is pretty easy to go farm up gear through doing that. The only thing that's really gonna feel bad is if you get like a 3-4 greater affix item and you end up bricking one of those or removing a stat that's super important for your build. That could feel pretty bad, but it's still not a legendary, so you can pretty easily replace that slot. And one of the main reasons I wanted to go over these changes coming to the system is because they talked about this being an eternal system added to the game just permanently. I really hope that happens, actually. I'm sure after Season 11, it probably won't be in Season 12, but I could very much see it being added back after they take their learnings from it and add it as a permanent addition to the game. And I think if they do add it as a permanent addition to the game, it will be a system that can just brick items and make them much weaker, but I think the game legitimately needs something like that. If you go play almost every other ARPG, they have systems that allow you to brick items that can either like brick your item, make it much worse, or just make it much better, or even have some crazy high possibilities of just getting the most cracked out items. Sanctification is kind of similar to like Val Orbs from Path of Exile. Pretty much all the other ARPGs also have systems kind of similar to this where you can brick an item or just make it much stronger. I think Diablo should have a system like this, even though I think it's not going to be as hardcore as those other games. More than likely, the lowest or worst possibilities would be brought up so they wouldn't be as bad, and they probably wouldn't have the high of high possibilities that some of the other games have either. But I do think having this kind of gambly crafting element added into the game as kind of a final step you do if you have replacement gear, I think it's just going to generally be better for the game. It would just add a lot of excitement when using this system. And I think that's one of the things that the Diablo 4 developers are trying to just add more into the game. They're trying to add those moments of dopamine, of getting super cool items, or of doing just something super cool in the game. And like the developers mentioned, you do need a downside for that upside to actually feel good. You need to have the possibility of failing something for succeeding at it to actually feel really good. And I think the Sanctification system could be a really cool way to do that. This isn't specific to Sanctification, but the developers did also mention that they are really wanting to add more crafting elements into Diablo 4, which is something that's legitimately unique to Diablo 4 when compared to other Diablo games. Diablo has never been a franchise that has a bunch of crafting systems like Last Epoch or Path of Exile. And Diablo 4 right now has the most amount of crafting we've gotten in the franchise, and I do really like them adding more of those elements into the game in the future, especially because I know they're not going to make it crazy complex like something with Path of Exile, and they're not going to make it super bloated like you could get with PoE 1. So I definitely like the changes they're making to Sanctification as a Season 11 specific feature, but I do hope we see this feature added in later down the road as a permanent addition to the game. But that's all I want to go over, so thanks for watching.